Hello, I'm Helen Bradley. Welcome to this video tutorial. In this tutorial, I'll show you how to create a translucent sphere in Illustrator, and we're going to look at some highlight effects that we can use with it. Before we get started with this video tutorial, let's look and see what it is that we're going to be creating. I'm going to show you how you can create a translucent sphere like this in Illustrator, and we're going to look at a number of different highlight techniques to create the highlights on this sphere. So there's a lot of things to learn here, even if it wasn't a sphere that you actually came here to create. To get started with our sphere, I've created a 200 by 200 point size image in Lightroom, and I'm working in RGB mode. That's fairly critical here. So I've chosen File and then New, set my width and height to 200 points, and made sure that color mode here is RGB. I've also created a small swatch of colors to use. White is the last of these colors. All I did was create a series of little squares and then fill them with the colors that I plan to use. Now we'll get started with our sphere. So I'm going to select the ellipse tool, hold the Shift key down as I drag out a large circle. Just put that into position, and I want to fill it with this color here, so I'm going to select the darker of the colors. Now, one of the ways that we add translucency to our sphere is to add some highlights. Now, there are a number of ways that you can apply these highlights, and I'm going to show you how to use the gradient mesh to do it. So I'm going to click here on the mesh tool, and then I'm going to click around my shape to create a sort of mesh over it. And because I want some lightening in this area here, I'm going to start with the mesh about here. So I'm going to click here, and that creates these lines for the mesh. I'm going to do about the same thing on this side here. And that's created two lines that sort of divide up this sphere. And now I'm going to add another one in here. And probably one up here, because I want to add a little bit of a highlight in up here. So now I'm going to work with the U tool, which is the mesh tool, and the I tool, which is this eyedropper sampler, to color in these mesh areas. So I'm going to click U to start off with, click on this point here, click I for the eyedropper, and then just grab a color. Now I don't think that that color is quite bright enough, so I might grab a slightly lighter color. And then I'll go down here and select this point, and then press the letter I and go and grab a color for this. And I'll continue to do this for the various points on the mesh. U to select a point, I to go and select a color to use at that point. And all I'm looking for right now is to add a bit of translucency to this shape. I'm thinking that that's working pretty well for me right now, although what I might do is add another line in here for my mesh, perhaps something like over here. And then instead of using this color, I'm going to press the I key and go and get a slightly darker color. If I'm happy with the mesh so far, I can just click away from the shape, and now we're going to add some additional highlights to our shape. Now, one of the highlighting effects that's really popular for these spheres is to use a sort of circular or semicircular highlight up here. So let's go to the layers panel right now, and I just want to lock down this shape that I've got, this mesh, because I don't want it to move as I'm working. It's just a little bit easier if you lock your mesh down. And now let's go and again get the ellipse shape and again draw out an ellipse. And I'm going to place it just up in the top area of this sphere. I move it by not letting go of the left mouse button, but just holding the space bar so I can move things around. As soon as I let go of the left mouse button, all bets are off. This shape's going to be in place, and I'll have to move it individually or a different way later on. So I'm just going to let go here. Now this has an orange fill, but I want to use a gradient, so I'm going to click on gradient. And now I'm going to the gradient here, and I want a white to black gradient. But what I want for my black is I want a real black. I need the blackest of blacks that I can get. So I'm going to go up here and grab the CMYK adjustment here. And I just want to make sure that this is pure black. So I want 100 in the K channel, and you can make it even more black by just making sure that the C and M and Y values are all 100% too. Now it's important to do a really black because the blacks that you get in RGB mode in the swatches panel aren't really true blacks, and so you won't get this really nice gradient screen effect. So you want to make sure that you come in here and make sure that you've got a really black to work with. So I'm working with a linear gradient. I need to rotate it 90 degrees. So I'm just going to select 90 degrees. And it's the wrong way around. Black's at the wrong end. So I'm just going to click here to reverse the gradient. Now I've got a black to white gradient and I want to blend it. So I'm going to go to the transparency options here. Click on transparency. I'm going to set the blend mode to screen. And the reason I do this is that this just brightens up the entire shape. And if it's too bright, then I'm just going to bring down the opacity. And I'll just click away. Now I'm going to add some lights here. Now one of the typical lighting effects is a sort of box of little white squares, and so we're going to go ahead and create those now. Now with nothing at all selected, I'm going to set myself onto a plain color. I'm just going to use an orange for now. This is going to be white in a minute, but because we won't be able to see the white, I'm going to start with orange. So I'm going to hold the Shift key as I drag out a square. Then I'm going to the direct selection tool and I'm going to Alt drag a duplicate away. I'm going to select both these shapes and I'm going to hold the Alt key as I drag down to create the fourth shape. So now I've got 4, but I've got a grid turned on and so these aren't actually lining up particularly well. So I'm going to hold the Shift key as I do because that constrains the movement in just one direction, and that's the downwards direction. Now I'm going to the direct selection tool. I'm going to select over the bottom anchors on this shape and just drag down a little bit, again holding the Shift key, so I create this sort of shape here. I'm going to go ahead now and group these together. Don't want to include this white shape here because that's just going to make a really big mess. So let's go to group here. Now with the direct selection tool, I can select on this shape and just move it into position. Again, I'm going to get my layers palette here and just make sure that I've locked down everything here except the group that I'm working with. Now I want to warp this group because I want to bend it. So I'm going to use a warp tool to do that. So I'm going to choose the arc warp. So I'm going to choose Effect and then Warp. I'm going to start with the arc and just see if I can get the shape that I'm looking for. It's warping in the wrong direction, so let's try vertical. Well, that's a little bit better, but it's a bit too much of a bend. So I'm just going to decrease the bend here so it's a little bit straighter. I can also work on some horizontal and vertical distortion should I wish. I think the horizontal distortion is actually going to work really well for me. Vertical, not so. So I'm going to set that back to 0. And I think that I can take this shape and just move it around, rotate it a little bit, and it's going to be perfect. So I'll click OK. I'm also going to set this to white fill now. So I'm going to get the eyedropper tool and I have a little white square here. So I'm just going to click on that so I have a white fill here. Now I'm going to the selection tool and I'm going to rotate this because I want it to sort of run along the side of this sphere. And I can also shrink the shape a little bit. And now that I've got it in position, I'm going to go to my transparency and I'm going to set it to screen blend mode. So it's going to blend into the layer below. And then I'm going to reduce the opacity. I just want it to lighten the sphere a little bit, but not be too much. So now that I've created this, I'm going to Alt or Option drag a duplicate away because I want this to go over on the other side of the shape. So I'm going to put it into position. Now I need to bend this correctly, so let's go into the appearance panel for this particular shape and let's go back to our warp arc. And now we're going to warp it back the other direction. And I'll click OK. And this I want quite a bit smaller, so I'm going to size it down really small and I'm just going to rotate it so it's following the sort of path of the circle or the sphere that we're working with. Now I'm going to add a few more highlights. one of the highlight effects I can use is a series of little dots. So I'm going to the ellipse tool. Let's just lock everything else down, just simply because it makes things so much easier. And let's drag out some ellipses. So there's one ellipse. I'm going to Alt with the direct selection tool and just create 3 little ellipses. And each of these I'm going to size down, making sure that I'm holding the Shift key as I do it so that I've got circles being created, not ovals, for this effect. So I'm going to take these little light spots and just position them where I want them to be. Select all 3 of them. And let's go to the transparency for these. We're going to set them all to the screen blend mode, and making sure that we've got them all selected, just reduce their opacity. Now we can also smooth them in the edges by using a blur. So I'm going to choose Effect, Blur, and then Gaussian Blur. I'm only going to use the tiniest of blurs here. So let's just see the preview here. And a 3.6 blur is way too much. So I'm just going to bring it down to about 1.7 pixels and click OK. And that's just softened that blur a little bit. And we're going to finish off with a sort of organic shape over here. So I'm going to go to the ellipse tool. I'm going to drag out a long ellipse. Now this is white filled right now, so let's just move it over the shape so we can see it. Again, let's go to the layers palette and lock down the circles that we drew a minute ago. I'm going to the direct selection tool. I'm going to click on this top anchor point here and click on the convert selected anchor points to corner, so it's now a pointy end. And now I can reshape it. I'm going to move it using the selection tool into position. Now I'm going to select the direct selection tool so I can just start working on these individual points. Well, it's not working correctly here. Let's just go and make sure that I've only got this point that I'm working with. So I'm going to work between the selection tool and the direct selection tool to just refine this shape a little bit. When I'm happy with this shape, I can go ahead and do the same with it. We're going to the transparency panel and we're going to set it to screen blend mode. And again, just adjust down the opacity of this shape. I've got this about 22%, but you just work at the opacity that's going to work for you. And you can move this around when you're done, or you might even choose, as I'm about to choose, to move this shape here around. So I'm going to go to this, which is one of my groups. And I think it's this one here. And I'm just going to move it into this area here. So now that I've got my sphere looking pretty good, we're ready to create the background and also to create the shadow. Now for my background, I want a color, so I'm going back to my themes to see if I can find a color that I will use for the background. I'm thinking this is kind of a nice green, so let's just open the swatches palette and let's go borrow this green and close down my color themes. I'm going to show you a really simple way of creating this sort of sunburst background. I'm going to the polygon tool and I'm just going to click in the middle of my document here. I'm going to create a 3-sided figure and just click OK. Now I'm going to the selection tool. I'm going to drag it down so it's a really, really tall triangle, and I'm going to push it in so it's going to look like one of the points of a starburst or a sunburst. Going to just make it the full height of the document. Now if I'm not happy with the color, I'm going to adjust that at this point. I think I want it to be a little bit brighter. So I think that's a pretty good color. So now I want to rotate it. I'm going to choose Effect, Distort and Transform, and then Transform. I'm going to set the preview on and I'm going to make sure that I rotate it using the top rotation point here. So it's the top middle point. So I'm going to click on that. I'm going to adjust the angle, and I want to do this to something that is a factor of 360, and 15 degrees is a factor of 360. So 15 degrees is one of those really good values that you can use here. So this is what it's going to look like, and now I'm just going to increase the copies until I go all the way around. So 23 copies is what I need, and I'll click OK. Now, if this is too big a gap, all I need to do is to widen my triangle, and that narrows up the gap between each of them. I'm going to drag it down so it's nicely in position. It's where I want it ultimately to be. Now let's have a look at the layers palette here. It's on the same layer as everything else. I think it would be easier to deal with if it were on a layer by itself. So I'm going to add a new layer. I'm going to take this path and put it on this new layer, and then I'm going to reverse the two layers. So I'm going to put one with the sunburst below the one with the glossy sphere. I'm just going to lock my sphere down for now. So we're just working with this sunburst layer. Now this sunburst, I can't go ahead and crop it right now because it's just a single shape. It's all just moving from this single shape. So I need to expand its appearance with Object, Expand Appearance. And now it's broken up into all its little sun rays. So I'm going to select the rectangle tool, and I'm going to make a rectangle that is the size of the artboard. And this is going to fill with that green color, which is just fine. So I'm actually going to duplicate it because I sort of need another one in a minute. So I'm just going to duplicate that one but hide it. And now I'm going to select the topmost rectangle, the one immediately above the sunburst, the one that's visible, and the sunburst itself. So I've got these two shapes selected, the filled rectangle on top of my sunburst shape. And now I'm going to my Pathfinder. Now the Pathfinder is here, and I'm just going to click on Crop. And what that does is it crops that shape to the rectangle, so it's now cropped to the size of the artboard. Now let's go back to our layers palette where I've got this other filled rectangle just sitting here. Well, I don't want it to be that big, so I'm going to select it with the selection tool. Let's just make sure that we've got it selected and not the sunburst, and let's just move it down into position. So this is approximately where I want it, and now I want to blend it. So I'm going to my blend or my transparency panel where I can blend things together. Going to select multiply, and I'm just going to reduce down the opacity. Let's go back to the layers palette. The background is now created, so I'm going to lock it and just shut it down. And let's open up the layer that has the sphere on it. So I'm going to add a shadow underneath the shape now. So I'm going to select the ellipse tool, and I'm going to select my color, and I'm going to use the darker color here, and I'm just going to drag out an ellipse. But because everything's locked down, I'm not able to do that right now. So let's go to an unlocked path, and let's just drag out the ellipse on that because that's where I'm allowed to work. So I'm going to make this a gradient. It's going to be a radial gradient. I'm going to click on this and make it the pink red color that I was using a minute ago. I'm going to set the outer opacity of the white to 0. The opacity of the red is going to be 100%. I'm going to the gradient tool here, and when I click on the gradient, you can see I've got a circular gradient on an oval. So I'm just going to shape this gradient down to match the oval that I've got here, and just drag out the ends of it. So now when I click away, I've got my filled sphere here, perhaps a little bit smaller than I want it to be. I'm going to move it into position, but you can see that we can still see the white edge. That fade to 100% transparency isn't quite working. Well, there's a really easy solution to that. Let's go to this path and let's just multiply it. So with this shape selected, we'll go to the transparency panel, and we'll just set this to multiply, because not only will that create a sort of darker shadow, but it also kills that sort of white light surround around it. I'm just going to move that into position. So now that I've finished, I can go ahead and get rid of the color swatches here. So they're at the bottom of the layers palette. Let's just go and get them here, and I can delete them by selecting the top one, shift click on the last one so they're all selected, and just drag and drop them onto the trash can, and that will get rid of them. So there's our final shiny sphere that we've created in Illustrator. We've seen a few different processes involved in creating the shines for this sphere, and you know now that you can apply a Gaussian blur to anything that you want to apply a Gaussian blur to, and use the screen blend modes and also gradients, and of course your gradient mesh to create this sort of shiny sphere shape. I'm Helen Bradley. Thank you for joining me for this video tutorial. Look out for more video tutorials here on my YouTube channel, and consider subscribing to my channel and you'll be alerted when new videos are released. And visit my website at projectwoman.com, where you'll find more tips, tricks and tutorials on a range of applications, including Photoshop, Lightroom, Illustrator and a whole lot more.